The U.S. has stepped up its airstrikes in Iraq, making it the largest military operation there since its troops withdrew in 2011. American warplanes have been targeting jihadists and their hardware, allowing Kurdish forces to retake control of Iraq's largest dam. Now, the strategically important facility supplies water and electricity to the north of the country. Islamists have managed to take over large areas of Iraqi territory and declared a caliphate there. Now, the UK's Prime Minister, David Cameron, called for a broader response to the threat posed by the Islamic State group, suggesting British military involvement. Let's discuss this now with John White, an author who has written extensively about the Middle East. He joins us live. You're live on RT International, Mr. White. The Islamic State group has made strong statements about their plans to expand their caliphate into Europe. Is that a real threat to Britain, or just talk aimed at getting media's attention?
Well, I think it's definitely the latter. I think the prospects of the Islamic State or any other such permutation moving into Europe is fanciful, to say the least. I think what they're doing is they're very cleverly playing on people's fears. They're able to whip up fear, a sense of moral panic, and this is very evident in the bellicose statements that we are seeing from people like David Cameron. David Cameron is clearly the political equivalent of Rip Van Winkle, the fictional character who goes to sleep for 20 years before waking up to find that the world has changed. And the idea that countries that were responsible for destroying Iraq are now going to go in and save it is really beyond parody.
You know, research has been carried out into how much public support the Islamic State group has in three of Europe's biggest nations. Apparently in France, it has reached 15%. How significant is that?
Well, it's significant if you take it in isolation, but I think there's more than one issue being played out in these figures. I think the domestic situation in France, regards to minorities in particular, is not very good. Social cohesion is very weak. We see that reflected in the success of the National Front, the far-right neo-fascist party, in the recent European elections under Le Pen. And so I think there's issues with youth unemployment, with the treatment of minorities, with a lack of social cohesion, because the French policy of assimilation of minorities is clearly a failed one. If you compare that to Britain, where we have a policy or a principle of multiculturalism, whilst not perfect, it certainly helps in terms of respecting the right of minorities to practice their religion and culture without too much molestation from the state. I don't think that's the same situation in France, and I think these figures reflect that. But it's also the fact that 3 decades and more of Western intervention in the Middle East, the slaughtering of millions of people or helping in the slaughter of millions of people across the Middle East, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, the double standards when it comes to Israel-Palestine. I think this has now been reflected in Western public opinion, not just amongst Muslims, by the way, in general.
I want us to just elaborate a little bit more on what you just touched on there in terms of the demographics. Staying with France, those aged 18 to 24 are shown to be the ones who are mostly supportive of this Islamic State group. The demographics, how big of a role do they play in things like this? And should we be worried that, like you said, minorities and those who feel that they're a little bit sidelined in society are actually going to join and supporting such radical groups?
Well, we should definitely be worried. I mean, the only way to defeat an idea is with a more powerful idea. And that more powerful idea at this point is lacking. We have mainstream parties who follow an ironclad consensus when it comes to the economy, when it comes to foreign policy. The youth are have never been more alienated all across Europe under the rubric of austerity, which is really just a mass experiment in human despair. Young people, especially from minorities and from low-income backgrounds, are having a hard time. So this is going to create a backlash, and we're seeing that backlash. But clearly there's a worry that the sentiment towards an opposition is being funneled to fanatics such as the Islamic State, formerly called ISIS. It's certainly a worry. But I think there's more than one issue being played out in these figures, as I said. I think the domestic issues in France, domestic situation in Germany and all across Europe is being bound up in these figures. Young people have never been more alienated than they are now. So clearly something has to be done to address their concerns.
Right. Staying with what you've just said, domestic issues could be behind some of these figures. 33% on that same research say that they blamed Iraqi instability on the US-led war. Do you agree with that?
I think that's absolutely self-evident. What we have seen exposed in the last week or so is that the moral high ground from which the US and its allies have long lectured the rest of the world on democracy and human rights and international law is in truth a stinking, smouldering dung heap of hypocrisy and double standards. We're now implementing and carrying out airstrikes in northern Iraq. Where were the airstrikes over Gaza against Israeli military forces as they were slaughtering women and children? Where was the no-fly zone? And these fanatics have been running rampant in Syria for the last 3 years in various forms. And we have been extending ourselves in trying to undermine the Syrian government. Not less than a year ago, we were contemplating bombing the Syrian government and Syrian forces. So the hypocrisy is very real. Why suddenly this call to arms when ISIS / Islamic State are running rampant in northern Iraq? I wonder if it's anything to do with the fact that the UK, the US and the West has extensive interests in oil in Iraqi Kurdistan has anything to do with it. I think to ask that question is to answer it.
John White, asking some very tough questions there on this issue. Author who has written extensively about the Middle East. Thank you.